Hello and welcome to WW2 TV, and we are doing one of our 80th anniversary shows. It was all happening 80 years ago in Dieppe, and I have two guests for you today, and we're going to go straight into it because they have got all sorts of media commitments, as you would imagine, because it's the 80th anniversary. We're going to go straight in, not a big introduction today. Alexander Fitzgerald-Black has been on the show before. He's an author, historian, and also recently a father, and Mary Eve Vaillancourt is part of the team at the Juno Centre in Normandy, and between the two of them they created the Dieppe exhibit that they're going to be talking about today. So I'll bring them both on. So good evening, folks. How are you today?
Good, Paul. How are you?
Very well. So it's been a busy one. The anniversary has been a busy one. I was just saying to Alex before going live, folks, a lot of coverage this year, a lot of coverage on social media. It seems to be getting a lot of attention, and that's good. But we've got your exhibition to talk about. So one of the things I want to talk about with you today is the idea of where we are 80 years on in understanding the raid, understanding the whys, the hows, and particularly how it is remembered, and also how it is remembered in Canada as opposed to France, as opposed to perhaps Britain, and Alex, you want to talk about Belgium as well. So we'll fire up the PowerPoint, and Marie, when you want me to move on the slides, just say where we are. But we'll start off with where we are, and well, I'll let you go through the PowerPoint. And do you want either of you want to start with kind of an opening statement about anything particular?
Interesting. There's so much to unpack, and we're looking forward to the next hour. We're going to try to keep it moving between Alex and I, and we had such an amazing time creating this exhibition. It's an exhibition meant for a European audience that doesn't know much about the raid. Like, we wanted to take into account those crowds who aren't experts, who don't know much, and who are kind of lost with all of this military jargon and tactical via strategic, those sorts of things. We wanted to keep it at a really human level so that people wouldn't necessarily judge it as an operation that was senseless or that was stupid. Like, we have 80 years later the benefit of hindsight with judging this event, and Alex and I will talk about this for sure. But what we have in the slides today is a guided tour of the exhibition and some of the thinking behind it, what drew us to pick some of the themes and ways that it's laid out. It was a co-writing exercise. I loved working with Alex on this. And I think we did a fairly good job. The exhibition is getting good reviews, and people appreciate it. So one of the things that is really important about this exhibition is this quote by Tim Cook, who's our leading historian in Canada, as everyone must know it, and I hope have read his books. They're incredible. And that statement guided a lot of the thinking behind the exhibition. He says the memory of Dieppe is like those stones layered upon each other, shifting unsteadily and disquieting. This is unsettled history, and yet it also dominates. The memory of Dieppe overshadowed the story of Canada's Second World War for much of the 20th century. And of course, it should be known that for a long time, Dieppe was more well-known in Canada than it was than D-Day and the Juno Beach landing. So we'll discuss some of that as well. But we wanted to create a story that multiple voices could be heard. As I explained before, telling the story to a European audience, telling a very Canadian story to make it fit into the European context. And we wanted to expose all these layers and the ripple effects too in time. We were just in a webinar earlier on talking about how the Dieppe raid happens, but then it continues to have effects over time, over decades. And the plurality of voices of Dieppe was really important. So that's how the exhibition is divided. We're going to talk about the context of 1940 to 1942, something really important for us. The plan and the slaughter, Alex will talk about. We'll both discuss the propaganda. I'll discuss it from the French perspective, and Alex and I can discuss it from the perspective of the Canadian press. And finally, we'll try to move through this quickly, because I think what Alex and I want to get to today is unpack that myth of, did the lessons learned at Dieppe lead to, that famous line that we hear over and over again, that we heard today on the news? Did it lead to save lives in Normandy? And, could it be that without Dieppe, the D-Day landings wouldn't have succeeded? These kinds of things we really want to take the time to unpack today with everyone that's attending. So with that, I'll move on to the next slide there. Of course,
just before to interrupt you there, and to get Alex's opinion, how difficult was it deciding on the language? And I know obviously you're doing the exhibits in English and in French, but just, you hinted yourself, there's words like disaster and mistake and tragedy and sacrifice and all those, and they're very emotive terms, and they mean different things to different people. But when you're trying to explain something that is a military operation, you've got to keep the language honest, but you've also got to keep it kind of level as well. So was it difficult deciding on the wording? Perhaps I'll ask you, Alex, on that first.
Yeah, I think we did put a lot of thought into that. I think in some ways we wanted the emotional side to come out in this exhibit. And so we were kind of willing to use some of that more emotive language. I mean, Zone 2, we call it the plan and the slaughter. We could have used other terms for that. We could have used, the plan and the disaster or something like that. But we did want to give people a sense of just, how deadly this raid was for those who were involved on the beaches. And there were some really interesting and hard conversations about the language we were going to be using and about what themes we would be developing through the course of building the exhibition.
Yeah, of course, the language, Alex put it best just earlier today when we were discussing this. We don't want to create an experience where everything is at an analytical level, devoid of emotions. And at the same time, we don't want just the emotions to shine through all the time. That wouldn't be a healthy balance. And I think we don't also want to glorify any of this as well. So it's a fine line to thread. And with that, we use the common means to exhibition making, artifacts, iconography, the infographics that we've used, largely thanks to Alex's amazing research. We're going to talk about throughout the slides as well, and some biographies. And the quotes we used, I'll share some of them today, are pretty brutal. I mean, I didn't even use all of the quotes that we used in the exhibition for the lack of space and time today, but there are some of them who we really wanted to make sure people would understand that this was serious business and that there was some serious fighting that went on that was desperate, and the courage that comes out of that shines through. Yes.
Brilliant. Well, we'll move on. So Zone 1.
So when you create an exhibition like this and you have multiple objectives, you really have to make sure that the zones speak to each of them. And we're trying to unpack so much here, like the reasons for the raid. You've got the classic ones that came out of mostly the first one and appeasing Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, and the idea of creating supposedly a second front. We'll talk about this later in the propaganda section, but that comes from the German propaganda machine. For the Allies at the time, the idea is to force German reinforcements to the coastal area and draw up the Luftwaffe. Alex will be speaking to the aerial battle a little bit more, responding to American pressure to create a second front, as I think that stems more from how well the Germans fed that propaganda about the supposedly opening of a second front. And then you've got the more tactical reasons, which hold a little bit more water: testing enemy defenses, having combined operations techniques, including the destruction of heavily defended deep water ports, and gathering intelligence to support the naval intelligence war, and of course, pinching operations during raiding, which we can also discuss in the later slides. So the context was really important for us to set up, and I think to a certain extent that was largely influenced by the work that David O'Keefe has done. We had a lot of considerations for his work. We spoke to him often, again and again. And we were like, what do we do with this new evidence? How do we portray it? And as a museum, we have to play a really safe line, like at the same time, we really want to offer the propositions available out there to the public to make their own decisions. So as such, we do talk about David O'Keefe's work, but what we decided to do was create a section on the context so that people wouldn't think that the Dieppe raid comes out of nowhere, that all of a sudden you have this idea for combined operations. No, there's a context for it. There's been other raids before the Dieppe raid which are successful, which lead combined operations to think they can carry larger raids like this. And there's also, I think what David O'Keefe has done is really bring out, as I was pointing out earlier, the Battle of the Atlantic Connection and the war at sea for intelligence documents. He does bring that out, and I think that holds water, and the public, those are the new stories 80 years after that are really important. So again, our objective was to showcase that as of early as 1940, the idea of butcher and bolt enterprises on the occupied Atlantic coast are already in Churchill's mind, and that we were able to really show that this thinking dates from 1940 at the time. I don't know, Alex, I'm sure you want to add certain angles here at this point, so I'll let you speak a little bit.
Do you want to hit the next slide there, Paul?
Yep. And, just my point, having seen the exhibition myself back in April, whenever it was, when you showed us around, Marie-Eve, and I very much appreciated the context, that so often Dieppe is just talked about in isolation, just this tragic raid. They don't talk about the commando raids and things before. They don't talk about, as you say, about the Battle of Atlantic. It's just presented as a one-off, and it's seen that way. But actually, as you explained in exhibition, as now David O'Keefe is saying in books and other people, it is part of a continuing effort to bring the war to Germany and to try different things as techniques are developed. So I think the context is really important. But Alex, we'll
and to add to that, we have to assume to some degree that maybe these visitors to our museum don't know much about the Second World War at all, right? And so we've got to start them with, the Germans invaded France in 1940, and by 1942, the war was still in the balance. The Allies didn't, we all know that the Allies won at the end of the day. We all know that D-Day succeeded and that, the subsequent actions succeeded. But at this point in the war, we didn't know that was all going to take place. The Battle of the Atlantic was very precarious in 1942, especially because of the intelligence war and how that was going, but also because of the American entry into the war and how vulnerable shipping was off their coast. The situation on the Eastern Front is not going very well for the Soviets, until later in 1942. But the Germans are in the midst of a great drive in kind of the summer of 1942, around the time of the Dieppe raid. So we wanted to bring all these things together. Yes, the Americans are in the war now, but they've got a few issues to deal with. The Japanese are running out in the Pacific, taking a lot of territory and building their the kind of defensive line, if you will, to defend their new empire. The British are having to deal with that. The situation in North Africa isn't looking so swell as well. The Germans could, be in Cairo and take the Suez Canal and cut Britain off with its empire. So that's the precarious situation we wanted to lay out for people as we set them up for the raid itself.
And particularly as we're now putting up, here's one of your great infographics there, the Battle of Atlantic, because this is the part that's really become part of the story, mostly because of David O'Keefe's work. Other people have mentioned as well, but it's the Battle of Atlantic and the intelligence war that has really come to the forefront the last few years.
Yeah, no, the situation is dire and desperate, and Churchill has got this on his mind all the time. And I think with hindsight, he does reflect in his later books after the war, like how he really thought we could lose the Second World War in 1942 because of this issue, the U-boats sinking so many merchant ships. And his solution to this, and the Allied solution to that, is, of course, what David O'Keefe exposed. It's the intelligence war and pinching anything that will help the Allies be able to, of course, break the German codes and get at the heart of Enigma. And Dieppe corresponds to that period of the blackout that lasts, for a good number of months, where we don't have enough intelligence to break the code. And I can let Alex speak about that further, because it's just so central to the context now.
Well, and I'll speak to these slides here. So some of the key players that we wanted to highlight, and there's a number of biographies throughout the exhibition to give people, and they're not just great leaders. Great leaders maybe in air quotes for Mountbatten. I don't know, depends on what you think. But the great leaders are on the one hand, but also the average participants, the private soldiers, the civilians, what have you. We profiled Lord Louis Mountbatten and General Harry Crerar. Crerar is important to profile in the context of this presentation because he's so critical to the memory aspect for Canada about how we remember the Dieppe raid, because he's both the Canadian military officer responsible for the raid, in terms of that was his official title as commander of 1st Canadian Corps at the time. But without him, the raid probably doesn't go ahead. Without him and the other Canadian generals, McNaughton being another, pushing for the Canadian involvement, maybe the Canadians aren't involved at all. Maybe Lord Louis Mountbatten gets his Royal Marine Division to do it or something like that. And then Lord Louis Mountbatten is so central to all that because, it's his command that's, crafting this plan with some input from the Canadians, but most of the outline plan is done before the Canadians get involved. And then after the war, as we'll probably discuss later, to his dying days, he always, he wanted to talk about how the Dieppe raid, assisted with D-Day. And, we've got some quotes as well from these two individuals here. Harry Crerar's, reasoning for getting the Canadians involved, it'll be a tragic humiliation if American troops get in action before Canadians, who have been waiting in England for 3 years. And then Lord Louis Mountbatten talking about, our job was to learn the technique of landing on enemy coasts and keep the Nazis occupied, in Western Europe. And so, we bring in these elements in the exhibition, as well as looking at some of the stories from, your average private soldier or and that sort of thing as well.
And I'm just to jump in again, and then we'll move on to the raid. I'm glad you took this approach as well, because so much of the D-Day connection is with the benefit of hindsight. People looking back afterwards and saying, oh well, because Dieppe happened up the coast, it must have affected the planning for Overlord, and they've connected things post facto that weren't necessarily connected at the time, and so that's why you've had to kind of take it back and almost strip it back to nothing and start this exhibition. That's what I liked about it. You started from nothing. You as you said, you're assuming people have little knowledge, but actually that's better as well for the people who have knowledge to kind of wipe away what they think they know and start it again with this modern interpretation of what history is all about. But well,
and that's really important, Paul, Woody, because for instance, the old what's the BBC series, The World at War, the only time Dieppe is mentioned is in the D-Day episode, and it's exactly. Mountbatten sitting there talking about it, right? And so for some people, that is the entry point. Like D-Day is the entry point to learn about Dieppe, and we wanted to peel that back, as you say.
Yeah. So I'll hand you back to both of you to talk about the raid now. So we've done the context, and now it's the raid itself. And was that raid was the word you always seized on for that? Not attack, not assault. Raid was that. It is the most commonly used word, but some people don't like it for that. It sounds a bit. Some people can say it can sound a bit kind of improvised.
Yeah, we needed to focus on the word raid to distinguish it throughout the exhibition from landings and amphibious landings meant to create a second front. You're really, when you compare operations that are much larger in scale, amphibious operations that are meant to open second fronts, that are meant to commence liberation, you're miles and miles away from the concept of a raid. This is actually why we chose that opening quote for the section on the raid, to get people back into the mindset of this in and out operation that lasts not even the space of a tide, that's meant to achieve micro objectives and then return. And this advice of a British commando to a Canadian gunner is just great, because it shows you the brutality and the experience that these British commandos have. This is where the Dieppe raid comes from. It has those kinds of roots, and I just found that passing of information and experience to be what should welcome visitors into a section that will talk about the raid itself. We use the word Dieppe raid. We don't use the Battle of Dieppe, which you'll see in Canadian history sometimes. It is a raid, and we want to keep it at that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, even battle gets a bad rap. They did a Battle of Dieppe commemorative coin a few years, probably 5+ years ago, and there was a lot of backlash about that, I got to tell you. So we wanted to also not just talk about, the typical image of the Dieppe raid is, infantry on beaches. And we certainly examined that in the exhibition, but we also wanted to bring particularly the naval and air components out, especially because those are some of where the international story gets told. Absolutely there were British commandos and American Rangers there on the ground, but it's really, at sea and in the air where you have the international component. So for instance, you've got the image on the bottom left there of the Polish Hunt class destroyer Slazak. And you can just see, it just looks like a battered, ship after, experiencing the Dieppe raid. And this just gives you an idea of the scale of the landing force, of the raiding force. Fairly small, only 9 landing ships, just shy of 200 landing craft, only 8 destroyers, and that's really telling in terms of the support that was offered. They did have the sloop there and the river gunboat, but the issue is there's just not enough firepower support for this operation. 8 destroyers is simply not enough. The destroyers have to some of them are being used as command ships. Some of them are tasked to escort and to, protect the landing areas from German naval incursions. And then they're also being asked to bombard enemy defenses. So there's just too many things for them to do and not enough of them to do it. And that's one of the things we wanted to bring out in this as well. If you want to go to the next slide. The air forces as well. Huge. This was the greatest air battle in history, perhaps at least on the Western Front to that time. And maybe you could do something on the Eastern Front to play with that. But for a single day, there were about 1,200 British, Canadian, and Allied aircraft involved. Some Americans as well. Belgian. There's a Belgian squadron. Czechs. Free French. So. That same kind of multinational flavor that you get on D-Day is already here in 1942 with the, RAF being such kind of an international force. You have American Eagle squadrons flying Spitfires with the RAF still. You have American Spitfire squadrons in the U.S. Army Air Forces flying missions. And you have B-17 flying fortresses who are actually flying a mission against Abbeville, the local Luftwaffe airfield. And they're flying some of their first missions of the war. And there's the list right there of the international representation. The Rhodesian Squadron is just a sponsored squadron. There were no Rhodesians in it as far as I know. The German Air Force was also heavily involved. Again, this was a very significant air battle. Unfortunately, the air support was just not adequate. The techniques had not yet developed to the point where they could really do the sorts of things they could do in 1944 and beyond. However, they did, the light bombers did manage to lay some smoke screens that were helpful at times during the withdrawal. For instance, largely the fighter force was able to protect the force as well. They did lose one British destroyer near the end of the day during the withdrawal, but in the grand scheme of things, it was a pretty good record. The Allies lost 106 aircraft, which was the larger single day loss of aircraft for the RAF in the war to that period, including all the days of the Battle of Britain, and the Germans lost about 48 aircraft. So a lot of people for a long time have said, "Oh well, the Germans clearly won the air battle." Then I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. The Allies did their job for the most part. They managed to defend the fleet for the most part and inflict significant losses on the Germans in at a rate that they were not able to do at this time in the war in other operations.
And I'm just glad it is being recognized as a multinational combined arms raid, because as a Brit growing up, when I was first interested in World War II history, Dieppe was always considered, well, that's the Canadian day. And even the British commando element kind of seemed to be put out of the story. But to reference now the importance of the air power and the Norwegians and Free French and Belgian thing, that's an important aspect of, obviously, this brings back to why the Juno Centre as a location, because of the international flavour of the visitors that go there. It is truly people from all over the world who go to Juno Beach, so they want to have a connection with it. And if you're coming there and you're a French visitor or Norwegian or Belgian, you've got your own little connection with that battle, which if you feel your connection with it, you feel closer to it, your understanding of it becomes more personal, and therefore you take away more from the exhibition, I would imagine. And there's the infographic, another one there about the makeup of the raid itself, which is, I'll let you explain.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear on the screen there. Obviously the bulk of the force was Canadian. The bulk of the casualties were Canadian. The commando forces on the flanks tended to do, at least in both cases, they at least partially or completely completed their objectives, and they didn't take terribly heavy casualties in doing so. And so they had a bit of a better day than the Canadians, unfortunately, on the main beach and on the at Puy at Blue Beach and at Green Beach at Pourville. The Americans, we wanted to make sure they were included as well, and we talk about them, also in the air power section. Can't forget there were some Free French commandos there as well, and a bunch of basically German nationals who had defected or left Germany before the war or during the war, because they did not agree with the Nazis. And so it was an international force. And this is one of my favorite parts, I think, of the exhibition, this map. And if you get a chance to go see it, it's just blown up on the back wall. So I don't know, it might be one of the biggest maps of the Dieppe raid ever made, except for maybe the ones they were using during the raid itself. But the idea of this map, just like the section, is it's supposed to give you kind of an idea of what was intended to happen and what actually happened. So the red arrows with the kind of hashed red arrows, those are the indications of what the movements were supposed to be. Most of those things didn't happen. The Orange Beach ones pretty much did happen that way, but the rest of them, were all pretty well different. And then the red arrows indicate, where the main landings occurred. The green arrows indicating where the German counterattacks kind of came in later in the day and throughout the day. I know David O'Keefe kind of got upset with me because he said, well, the map's big enough. You could probably have included they were supposed to get into the harbor with HMS Locust and everything. And I was like, damn it, David, I wish I'd thought of that earlier. But, it's just not on. The interesting thing, it's not on really any of the maps, right? It's even in David's book, to be fair, there's no map of this scale that actually includes that. He has a blown up map that includes that. So I just didn't think of it. But yeah, we wanted to kind of give everybody a sense of what was supposed to happen. And not only does the map do that, but there's a lovely timeline that Mary-Eve created below it that takes you an hour by hour account of what was happening at the various landing beaches and what the experiences were of the troops there. The tank support piece is really interesting, and we have we were originally going to have an even more detailed infographic about this. But one of the things where the plan was the tanks were going to land with the infantry or even ahead of the infantry, just like they were supposed to kind of on D-Day, and they would advance and provide cover fire so that the infantry could advance, into the main town. The problem is, if you've ever been to Dieppe, it's, you got the beach, you've got the esplanade, and then you've got various roads that get you into the main town. But all of those roads, of course, have been blocked by the Germans. So the only way to overcome those roadblocks, because again, there's not very heavy firepower from the ships offshore, is for engineers who are on foot to approach the obstacles and destroy them with demolition charges. And unfortunately, because the tanks ended up being late and they couldn't provide that crucial cover fire, and the tanks themselves did not have heavy enough weaponry to do this themselves, the engineers were all pretty much, killed or wounded or unable to advance. And therefore, the momentum of the entire attack stops almost immediately. And it's interesting because, of course, in a lot of accounts of the raid, the Chert Beach is really what sunk the tanks. They all got stuck. Well, in reality, actually, very few of them got stuck because of the chert. About out of the number that landed, which was 27, I think about maybe 4 to 7 of them actually got stuck in the chert. Many of them actually made it across the beach and over the promenade onto the promenade, but the engineers were all gone, so there were no gaps, so they couldn't go anywhere. So they ended up kind of circling around, firing their guns at whatever was firing back. And a lot of them actually ended up parking themselves, as you can see in the middle image there, on the main beach in a sideways configuration. Some of them would have been disabled there as well. And the idea was they could hopefully provide some artificial cover for the infantry that were still stuck on the beach. And so a lot of these images after the raid show, the tanks never got anywhere. Well, a lot of them did. It's just that the circumstances didn't allow them to be as effective as they could be.
And there's a lot to unpack there with the tactical lessons learned for D-Day, right? Because on D-Day, you see the infantry and tank coordination at a level that none existed for the Dieppe raid, of course. And the beach exits are demined right away as soon as the landings commence on Juno Beach, and the cooperation between the British engineer units and the combat units with the Canadian infantry is highly successful. The beach exits are cleared right away, and the success there for the coordination is really substantial, unlike the Dieppe raid. So arguably, there are some lessons learned. I know we don't want to go ahead of ourselves, but definitely an interesting aspect that is shown through these images.
Yeah, well, the lessons learned is, obviously, as the war progresses, lessons are going to be learnt, just because that's how armies and navies and air forces learn their trade. The thing that's complicated the issue here is the fact that people have suggested that it was all about just trying to learn something, which is obviously not the case. It's that, yes, you can learn stuff as you go. But we had questions earlier on the sidebar about the use of German sources and the German reaction to the battle. And I know you particularly, Marie-Eve, you're going to talk about the French side of things after battle. But this, you do include the German reaction to the battle as well. So I'll let the two of you explain this as well.
Yes, this one is, I ended up having to cut quite a few of the German impressions for this PowerPoint presentation. I wanted to include even more, but I chose this one because it brings both sides, their analysis of the Canadians who, they say, we were amazed at the attacker who fought with bravery against an opponent who could not be seen. Taking cover behind their dead comrades, they shot uninterruptedly at our positions. Thus, with their bodies, these dead soldiers provided their comrades with the last service of friendship. A really moving quote. But then if you look at the first part, the Germans are describing essentially how they are to themselves inexperienced, and how some of the soldiers are actually throwing up constantly because this is their first action. So that was an interesting sort of pivot point that we wanted to include. The German losses, of course, are so minimal that clearly it's a defeat, and they're successful at this. But this one, I thought provided a really neat example. Yeah,
and as of course the Germans learned things as well. I mean, when we go to Dieppe today, there are the fortifications that were there in 1942. Then there are the fortifications they had added after 1942, ready for the big invasion. So the Allies are learning, but it's important to remember the Germans are also learning how to defend and what they should be doing and putting more defense in. So both sides learn. But we'll move back to these fantastic infographics, and I'll let you explain that one, Alex.
Yeah, so this one, we wanted to do some research into this. Kind of was hoping maybe to get something with Verdun for a French audience, but Beaumont Hamel, we decided to try to compare somewhat apples to apples, or at least different species of apples together. One day, one battalion, one regiment, and the involvement, just to show people. Everybody kind of knows about the Somme and just how bad it was, right? And so we wanted to put that beside the experience of the Royal Regiment of Canada at Puy at Blue Beach, and the casualties there by a percentage basis for the Royals they're worse. And it's very sad. And I mean, there was far more fire support available to the Newfoundland Regiment at Beaumont Hamel. At least the preliminary bombardment was significant. there was no preliminary bombardment for the Royals. There was a couple of attempts to bomb the local gun batteries, but they got caught in an impossible situation. They landed too late, a little bit too late. The sun was coming up. They were exposed. The Germans were they were basically ready for them because they had actually decided to start an anti-invasion exercise as the landing craft were approaching the beach, and that's really where that slaughter does happen, sadly.
And now we get to some of the exhibits themselves, and I'm fearing, because you may have to go away for other commitments, we may need to crack on the pace a bit. It's my fault asking questions, but I'll hand it back to you to tell it. You steer it, Alex and Mary.
Well, let's keep going. Let's get to Zone 3 and talk about kind of the aftermath of the raid and the propaganda side of things, because that's really interesting, and it's caught up in kind of what we're already talking about. So the Allied propaganda, what's really interesting about the Allied propaganda is there was a plan, this is a great quote from a Canadian historian about this. There was already a propaganda or a PR plan, let's call it a PR plan in place. And there were actually two PR plans that the Combined Operations Headquarters had. Plan A was, if it's a victory, you focus on the points of the victory, the objectives achieved. You also focus on the bravery of the soldiers involved. If it is a failure, you focus on both the bravery of the soldiers involved, but you also focus on the lessons learned for next time. And so this feeds into Lord Louis Mountbatten, and for the rest of his life, he's maintaining a PR story that was crafted even before the raid. And while the raid doesn't have specific objectives to deal with, lessons learned, certainly the PR spin does. And I want to turn things over to Mary-Eve for the next slide. I think it'll be either German propaganda. The families wait for news. You can speak to this, Mary-Eve. And these things are related because that's the first brush that Canadians had with, what had happened on the beaches in Dieppe.
Yeah, if you could turn to the next slide. So this is a small version of pages and pages of the Globe and Mail in September of 1942, where the lists of missing and wounded and killed and taken prisoners are mixed and exposed to the Canadian public. So if you were to zoom in on them, you'd see some really cheerful headlines. And so that confuses the Canadian public even more, like the fact that the public relations of Combined Operations had decided earlier, even as Alex said, the raid was over, that it was going to be fed as a positive story. When you've got these amounts of casualties being listed in newspapers with cheerful headlines, you kind of get the sense that that something wrong is happening. And we sifted through so many letters, hundreds of them, of Canadian families asking the Canadian government what's happening. And actually today, earlier during the official ceremony at Dieppe, the youth read a number of them. It was quite poignant, which revealed to me there was so many more than just what I saw, and I've seen literally hundreds. So this one actually was quite interesting because you've got, of course, the mother and the wife of a soldier, and she's wondering what has happened to her husband. But notice the date. She writes this in May 1943, which is unreal when you consider the amount of time that has passed since the Dieppe raid. She still has no understanding of how her husband has died in May of 1943. And this is one of the letters she wrote after repeatedly writing other letters. So it's at the time, now with hindsight, okay, so many were wounded, so many were killed, so many were taken prisoners, but you have to remember that it took months to get to that stage of knowing which was what and giving news to the families with very little information. We even discovered during the making of this exhibition, not all Canadians who died at Dieppe are buried in Dieppe. Some of them are buried in Belgium and Holland. They washed ashore kilometers and kilometers away with the tides from Dieppe, and are now buried in Belgium and Holland. So that's way after the fact, and I'm drifting away from the propaganda topic, but this is the sort of statistics that Canadians woke up to, the day after in the weeks and months following Dieppe. If Canada was to be hit with those kinds of news during the Afghanistan war, it would be a major trauma. We have to reconsider these figures. Overnight, you've got the city of Toronto, who's got, most of them are casualties, and we're talking of hundreds of people from various cities all at the same time across Canada. It's never been seen since the end of the Second World War. It's still our bloodiest day in Canada's military history.
Wow.
One of the things that happened after the raid is that Russ Munro, who was a Canadian press journalist, who was present amongst 9 other war reporters at the Dieppe raid. This is something that's pretty special. It's the first time that reporters can go into such close action with the troops. He comes back to Canada and does like a mini tour of the cities that were hardest hit. This is an impressive photograph where you see thousands of Canadians gathered to listen to what he has to say, because people are hungry for news from people who have seen the action and can tell a little bit more of what has happened. Of course, Munro focuses on the bravery, and again, much like Combined Operations, feeds a positive story. I think there's a quote about him on the next slide. No, it's actually the French slide, but he says, he calls it a disaster and a triumph. He calls it a feat and a conquest. And he says, that the courage and the audacity of Canadians electrified the world's free people. So he's trying to feed a line that won't put the public at odds with our war effort at the time, which is something to consider. We've got a whole society mobilized for the war effort. You can't feed them a failure and a disaster at this point, so it's a really close call for there's a certain amount of self-censor on top of the censorship already in place for those journalists such as Russ Munro.
I think it adds, sorry to interrupt, it adds to this the sense when Alex and I were talking before you joined us, there's still questions that will never really get a satisfactory answer about the Dieppe raid. There's still certain elements of mystery about the planning and the reasoning behind it. And obviously this period after the battle, when people who had been involved, they couldn't tell everybody what it was all about. They couldn't tell the families everything, every detail. It's part of the combined operations. There's elements of secrecy, there's naval intelligence. So it adds to this idea of it never really being a clear story. I mean, after June the 6th in 1944, everyone knows that's the establishing of the Second Front. It's a fairly easy idea to take on board, but the Dieppe raid at the time, let alone now, was difficult to kind of convey to people. So it's added to everybody's misunderstanding, confusion about it. But we'll move on through the propaganda, and because I'm really interested in the aspect you put about the German and the French side of things. So back to you, Marie-Eve.
Thank you. Yes, the French are occupied, of course, and what we wanted to really bring out for our visitors was for them to understand that the French really hesitated in helping the Canadians out because they felt like there could be retaliation. And by retaliation, I mean execution and deportation. So it was clear that their angst and their hope that this was the final moment of liberation for them was real. And this is, again, with hindsight, they don't know that this is a failure. They think this is going to bring them victory, and it doesn't, and the Canadians tell them this is only a helping hand, and they retreat and they leave. So just to bring visitors back to what that would have been like at the time to experience that kind of fear and angst for the Germans. And of course, one of the things that is really crucial in Dieppe civilian memory is the fact that Hitler wanted to personally thank the citizens of Dieppe for not having helped the Canadians, which isn't true. They didn't help them by fear of reprisal, and they certainly didn't hinder any of them, and they were traumatized by what they saw unfold. But Hitler wanted to thank them personally by giving money to the mayor, who then actually refused and instead negotiated the return of 1,500 prisoners of war from German captivity in Germany from the fall of France of 1940, of course. And they returned to Dieppe in September of 1942 with an immense amount of guilt for having been liberated from captivity at the expense of so many Canadian war dead. And that's an aspect that if we weren't going to, there was no way we could avoid talking about that with having a show about Dieppe in France, because it's such a huge part of the Dieppois experience. Yeah.
And we've got a couple more examples of the German propaganda and how far it spread around Europe. It wasn't just a story within France. It got as far as Lithuania. So again, back to you.
Yeah. I'll speak to this one if you don't mind, Mary-Eve. The big thing for the Germans is they get to showcase, the second front is kaput. We've put a stop to it already. We don't have to, it's important for people to understand, and this is something we wanted to bring to them in the exhibit. The German perspective of the raid, it's kind of a small relative pinprick, and the main focus for them in 1942 is the Eastern Front. It's the war against the Soviets. And this is going to show, Joseph Goebbels and the propaganda machine can use this to show you don't have to worry about the Western Allies. You don't have to worry about the Western Front. We've got that handled. Let's focus on the Eastern Front and winning that war.
Yeah, the examples there we can move through. There's another one with Poland. And I think for the sake of time, because I really want Alex to be with us for Zone 5, we can move ahead and perhaps skip the captivity section. And
we'll move straight to remembering, because that's the key thing, is where we are. As I started off the show, 80 years on, what was your intention to try and help the world remember this, and what about it?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, we wanted to make sure that people wouldn't be comparing bananas and apples. So the Dieppe raid, you cannot compare it to D-Day. So there cannot be a straightforward path from Dieppe to Juno, unlike the title of the exhibition, actually. But the essential point to make is, and we have infographics that show to this on the next slide, the comparison between the size and the scope of the operation. When you compare them and you put them side by side, at least it takes people away from the temptation to say, oh, one thing led to the next. No, it's an entirely different operation. And if you go back to the previous slide, which Alex will be able to comment on, there's other amphibious landings that happen after Dieppe and before D-Day that are meant to open second fronts, that are meant to commence liberation and the Second World War, that occur where there's amphibious is at play, combined operations, at least in terms of combining the three arms, I mean, at a larger scale, are happening and lessons are being learned. And these fronts need to be managed before D-Day can even occur. So that kind of puts the theory of Dieppe to Juno and D-Day out of the water right away with these infographics. At least that's what we were hoping to do.
Alex, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and it's just important to understand the timeline there and to see, yes, there probably were some lessons learned at Dieppe, but maybe they applied those lessons in Operation Torch, and then they learned lessons there. Although in Operation Torch, they did directly assault ports again, and that didn't go all that well. So did they learn the lesson for that? I don't know. And there's different lessons that are learned. And the other thing to keep in mind, of course, too, and Mary-Eve's already alluded to this, these are very different animals. It's one thing to do a single day raid. It's another thing to establish a bridgehead that you're going to build up over weeks and if not months to fight a protracted battle, right? And those are two different kettles of fish. So I think some of the tactical lessons are relevant, but perhaps less, as Mary-Eve said off the top, less of the operational or strategic lessons are quite as relevant.
Yeah, the coordination of. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say what I think we'll do is because Alex has to do a hard leave in 5 minutes' time, is we'll just remove the graphics for a second. Alex, carry on talking about what the Dieppe raid means to you as a Canadian. I know, Mary-Eve, you're Canadian as well, but English speaking, you know what I mean. And then when you have to go, Alex, we'll carry on with Mary-Eve from the kind of the French and the Juno Centre within Normandy point of view. So I'd rather just kind of spar a bit while we've still got you, Alex, about where you feel you are, where as a Canadian, as a historian, where are we with the understanding of Dieppe right now?
Well, it's interesting because when I first, well, it may not have been my first time visiting Dieppe, but my first time visiting Dieppe with a serious group was in 2011. And I think back then I was very enamored with the lessons learned theory, like argument or narrative. And I was, well, at the end of the day, it was all worth it because of that. And now, 10 years later, a lot more historical thinking, a lot more research behind me, I'm, really off that bandwagon almost entirely, having kind of better understood what other operations were going on in the war, and also just understanding, understanding how, while there may have been some minor lessons learned, at the end of the day, Dieppe is very much, always has been perhaps, and maybe always will be about, it's such a controversial thing, trying to answer that question of why. And it comes down to, we're always kind of searching for that reason, and it is elusive. And the lessons learned narrative kind of gives us a feeling of satisfaction. Well, at least it wasn't for nothing. Yeah. And, now David O'Keefe has brought in a new angle, which is the intelligence gathering. And there were other intelligence gathering items involved in the raid, from, well before David and his research came into play, but nothing on the scale of what could have had an impact on the war, as what David's does with the war at sea and the Battle of the Atlantic. And so, there's a temptation there to think, well, if only they'd pulled it off. But the fact is they didn't. The fact is that, they didn't get any intelligence for the Enigma, for Bletchley Park. And they had a whole lot of casualties to show for it. And sometimes, and there's a really great quote, I think it's at the end of our slide deck there, disasters like this bring us to the limit, up to the limits of our ability to offer explanations. Maybe there is no real explanation that's going to appease or make everybody feel better about the fact that this raid, just went so poorly. The one thing that we can say is that at the end of the day, the Canadian Army did return to Europe. It did liberate the town of Dieppe, and it had its day to kind of celebrate that and to move on to continue to defeat, Germany in the war. And that's the interesting thing about it, is that we talked about off the top, for many, many years, the Dieppe raid was kind of the primary battle or event that Canadians would think about when it came to the Second World War, partly because it was just so traumatic and there was so much loss on that single day. But that was to some degree at the expense of some of the more important things that came later that helped to win the war. At Juno Beach, the liberation of the Netherlands, the work that the Canadian Army did in Italy, the work that Canadians did with Bomber Command and in the Battle of the Atlantic. And, we need to mark this day. We need to make sure that we honor those who fell 80 years ago. But we also can't lose sight of the fact that it was, one event relatively early in the war, at a dark period in the war. But there are other events that maybe Canada redeemed itself. I don't know if you want to talk about it that way. But there's other things to talk about that were successful. And we don't have to say, as General Curard did on June 7th, 1944, that we were successful because of what we did at, the lessons learned at Dieppe. Maybe a little bit. But
yeah, and we'll let you go in a minute, but just I think it's because we now have a lot more data about those other commando raids in 1940 and 41 and the things going on in 43, that we don't just see Dieppe and D-Day as two single events and nothing else in between. It goes back to this idea of this contextual understanding of it being progression. I mean, you mentioned Torch there. I mean, why has Torch never got talked about as a learning curve for D-Day? Because it's much more of a comparable scale operation and broad experience comparing Torch and D-Day as Dieppe and D-Day. But Alex, you're going to have to go, aren't you? So we'll let you go, and then we'll carry with Marie-Eve. So Alex, I want to just say thank you on behalf of the people of Normandy and the tour guides for being part of this incredible exhibition, because it is really good. It does what it's supposed to do. So thank you for taking time out on what has been an incredibly busy day for you today on this 80th anniversary. But it's really cool for us to have you there, and we'll carry on with Marie-Eve for a little bit longer. So Alex, it's been great talking to you, my friend, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, Paul, for having us. Really appreciate it.
Good. So we'll let you go, and I'll carry on with Mariam. So we'll bring up the slide deck again, Mariam. And if you're happy with carrying on talking another 10 minutes, I mean, you've been busy as well, so I don't, you've been doing all your stuff with CBC this morning.
Yeah, Alex and I have packed the interviews back to back all day, and I have quite a few more to do. In fact, I'll be able to stay on for a few more minutes as well, and trying to finish the deck. But what we call an important healing moment, and we've alluded to this, is the return to Dieppe in September of 1942, which must have been such an incredible moment to experience, especially for the Canadians who get to visit the soldiers at the Dieppe cemetery, for the civilians to see the Allies once more, but this time for real. And then one of the greatest, I'm going to move through some of the slides at the end here with our objects and the meaning of memory, and I can conclude with that. But the artifact that was brought up just before on the other slide was a flag given to the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division from the prisoners of war of Dieppe as a thank you. Again, what I was talking about, a great artifact that we're able to add context and meaning to that experience with the French civilians. And of course, when we get to the memory questions, we've skipped a couple of points in the captivity section, where I just want to point out one aspect of the captivity, which, aside from, the physical traumas of the death marches and the experience of having been in captivity for 3 years, you also have psychological traumas. And one thing we discovered in making the exhibition is that it's not until 1976 that veterans of Dieppe get compensation for the traumas that they experienced as prisoners of war. So you've got veterans who have compensation, and Canada had a really great plan for veterans when they return home. Dieppe veterans, in terms of psychological trauma, not so much, and they had to fight for these compensations to arrive, and to think that it took until 1976 is kind of mind-blowing. Wow. And yeah, to go back to some of the amazing artifacts we were able to acquire for the exhibition, this poster really puts things in perspective. It was published as early as 1946, and it shows Dieppe as one of the clouds with Falaise, Ortona, Caen, and of course it's flying, all of this is flying above Vimy Ridge, so with a field of poppies. So I think it entered our memory, and these names, it's funny because they're side by side in this image. There's not one that's more important than the other, but anyways, that's a really testament to the early memory of the Dieppe raid in post-war period. We'll jump to one that dates from 2006, which was really compelling to put into the exhibition. This was an anti-war in Afghanistan protest sign used in 2006. And of course, you see the pull and the weight of Dieppe being expressed here once more as a suicidal mission, like Beaumont Hamel, And perhaps one of the most important aspects of that last zone that I want to conclude with before we discuss further or take some further questions is the Cvsm medal that you see here. The Cvsm is the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal, and this particular one has a Dieppe clasp added to it. This does not come until 1991. So Dieppe veterans wanted special recognition. They wanted a medal or some form of formal recognition on their medals that distinguished them from, other veterans who had fought in other campaigns. And it was refused to them for a number of years until finally they gained cause in 1991 and were able to add this little clasp that says Dieppe on it, on their Canadian Service Volunteer Service medals. So that goes to show that for a number of years there was a certain amount of we forgot, there was there's gaps in our collective memory, and there were times when our past or our military history wasn't as popular or as well known as it is today. Yeah, and the 80 years take. It goes up and down, but 1991, that's quite late, especially in a veteran's lives. This is at the end of their lives.
And amazing. We should touch on the famous Bell advertisement, which some people watching will not be familiar with, but I'd never heard of it until a couple of years ago. I was surprised how important that was. It really hit the emotional heartstrings of Canadians. So and you acknowledge that in the remembering aspect as well.
Yeah, we were lucky to have that video in there. It dates from 2008, and in dealing with the Bell Canada is basically, I don't know what you would call it in Britain, but in France, it's kind of like Orange,
Yeah.
It's the major telecompany in Canada. It's been around for hundreds of years, literally. They created this ad for November 11th in 2008. And it's basically a conversation between a grandfather and his grandson who's actually visiting Dieppe, and he uses a cell phone to call his granddad.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing. When I first saw it, I was moved by it, as I think everybody was, especially if you're Canadian. But I'm conscious of the fact, you've got lots more things to do. So I really want to because I haven't seen you since I went to see the opening of the exhibit, and we didn't talk long there. You've now had it there running for a few months. I really want to get an idea of what the reaction has been and what the reaction has been from people from different nations, because obviously you've had, thankfully, Canadians and people from the other side of the Atlantic are coming now this year after the COVID period, but you've had the French and the Belgians and the British. So has the reaction been different regarded from different nationalities? What notable kind of things have you come away with from the reactions of different types of people going to see the exhibit?
Unfortunately, we haven't had that many Canadians visit it yet. Not that I've had clear feedback. It's mostly been our European audience, largely French historians as well, who we've come to work with or know of quite well. Our community. The reviews are extremely positive, and I think we pride ourselves in making exhibitions that a varied type of audience will recognize themselves in. I think providing the German and the French perspective really helps with that. It's one thing to try to tell, just if we were to just tackle the Canadian story and leave it at that, I don't think it would move people. And I think it's one of the objectives of the exhibition is to show that others were affected by this, not just the Canadians. And I think it fits in line with the mandate of the Juno Beach Centre to remain relevant, to keep that edge and bringing exhibitions that foster thinking and critical thinking as well.
No, definitely. And we're having questions about how long the exhibition will be there.
Till December 2023. So you still have some time.
Nearly a year and a half to go. So, I mean, obviously you have got other things to do, but I want to just the last question about, we asked Alex what it means to him. What does it mean to you? Because French Canadian living in France, different perspectives of things. Has helping create this exhibition helped you firm up your own understanding of what Dieppe means, and is it different now at the conclusion of the exhibition than it was when you started the research?
No, my position on it hasn't changed that much. As a French Canadian, I must say that Dieppe sits in a really tough spot in Quebec collective memory. It's even worse than in Canadian collective memory. It's intertwined with the conscription crisis. A generation of Quebecers have thought of the Dieppe raid as a butcher of English senior, generals using French Canadians,
sacrificing Canadians,
fodder, those sorts of things. So it's even deeper in Quebec, and it's filled with assumptions and misconceptions because conscription, the crisis of conscription in Canada gets mixed into that, whereas there's a generation of French Canadians, especially those who lived through, the independence period, the 60s, the 70s, who think that French Canadians sent there were actually conscripts and conscripted troops, where it's not the case. Conscription for overseas service wasn't even in place. So that, to me, as a French Canadian, is the story that we're happy to tell again and again, to reconcile French Canadians with that history. And I've been so lucky and grateful to be part of making an exhibition that redresses some of the myths that I hope won't exist in Quebec. And in fact, I've got a bunch of interviews lined up with French Canadian media who seem to be really interested in this, moving beyond. So I'll close with that. Jack Granatstein, a great Canadian historian, who says quite astutely that history must be written anew for each new generation. And I think he's right. And I think that the Juno Beach Centre has been able to contribute to that, writing a new version for a new generation. And that's how you keep going. And it's been an incredible ride to make an emotional ride to make an exhibition about such a difficult topic.
Well, that was a perfect way to end it. So I'm going to say thank you very much for taking the time out today to join us, and back to the media, the media calls you have today. I mean, I guess it goes with a job, and clearly, yours and Alex's passion for this and your determination to get it right. And I think you said it perfectly. It's bringing people together. It's bringing the Canadian, the French Canadian, the British, all these, the German experience all together in this exhibition. So, well, good luck with it. I will get to go and see it again. I saw it that first day, but I will go out and see it at some point. But thank you very much for joining us, Alda. And on behalf of World War II TV, thank you everybody for joining us today. I will see you again Monday. We have a whole host of shows coming up next week, including the Falaise Gap and various other things, but I will let you follow that on YouTube. So thank you, Marie-Eve. Thank you, Alex. I will see you all next time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.